My name is Raquel Bach, and I am Dee's youngest adult daughter. It was a Saturday, and I went over to her house, and that was the last time I got to see her. My mom had a heart of gold and would do anything for anybody.
The goose in the house, staying in the starlight, and looking down in the house for the night.
If you needed her, she would be there. But you also didn't want to get on her bad side, and you didn't want to lie to her, because she took care of business.
My name is Amy Alexander, and I have known Dee for the last 12 years. Dee was the life of the party. She radiated light. She radiated life. She texted everybody and had to know everything about everyone because she genuinely cared for people. She always went above and beyond for people. A very, very giving woman.
Her kids and her grandkids meant everything to her. I have an older sister and then 2 older brothers from my dad, and then Angelina, half-sister from my mom and her second husband, Dale.
My sister and Mr. Warner took up when they were both married. It raised a lot of eyebrows, particularly because you wouldn't match them. I mean, she had a dynamic personality that was outgoing and vivacious. He had more of an introvert personality, so they were dynamically polar opposites, not only in their personalities, but also in how they presented themselves. He'd be far from a GQ guy for sure. She was more high-maintenance, well-taken-care of woman. In fact, I don't ever remember seeing her out of the house without her makeup on. And he was the total opposite. I mean, I never seen the guy without a pair of blue jeans on, a work shirt, and a pair of work boots.
Their way of meshing was business. And I think that's what drove them together. They had the same dreams, the same goals, and they could accomplish that together. You know, they started with 1 business and then grew to 5.
My name is Mackenzie Keyline. I'm an anchor and reporter with WTVG 13ABC. So I cover a lot of Lenawee County. That's a bit of my beat. I'm also from the area. Lenawee County is a very rural area, and Dee and Dale Warner's family is definitely a dynasty in the community, specifically when it comes to the farming side of things. They both have farming backgrounds that span generations. Dee's family, her brother Greg Hardy, has a mega dairy farm just down the road. And Dale also started his business, War Ag, and then Dee started what was a trucking business, so they were very well known. But family and friends will tell you that this was no perfect marriage. They had a rocky relationship. A lot of times they had arguments that were based on their business.
There were some very poor business decisions that were made, and she always felt like she had to fix everything. She would often talk to me about divorcing Dale or leaving Dale.
That conversation happened a lot, where she was going to leave, she was going to divorce him, she was done. When I was young, we would leave and we would go stay at a hotel. We'd stay at my uncle's for a night or 2, and then we'd go back, and everything was fine until the next fight, and we'd leave. My house is actually right behind my mom's farm. So usually every Sunday, we would go over to her house in the morning and have breakfast. So it was just a normal Sunday. I went over there with my family. She wasn't there. We walked all around the house. I couldn't find my little sister or Dale, so I assumed she was maybe with them, but she wasn't responding to my text messages, so I called her, and her phone went straight to voicemail, which doesn't happen, ever. She never shuts her phone off. I knew that if she wasn't going to be there, she would have told me, so that was a huge red flag to me. Dale ended up calling me a couple hours later and asking me if I had heard from her and said, well, she's mad at me again, and she was leaving him for good. I was too shocked at the situation to even comprehend what he was really saying. I just stayed quiet. I just had a really strange feeling.
on Sunday evening, I confronted Mr. Warner face to face and said, Dale, and this is a quote, "What the hell went on here? What the hell happened?" He explained to me that they'd had a horrible fight the night before. She'd been very upset, and he had given her a back massage on the living room floor, and she fell asleep. He picked her up and put her on the couch about 10:30 or so, and he went to bed. And when he got up at 6:30 in the morning to go out to work at the farm, she was snoring on the couch. He said, you know, that she took off. He reaches in his left-hand pocket and pulled out her wedding ring in his left hand and bounced it up and down like a golf ball. And he said, she left this on my desk. Many things were bizarre. There was no evidence of any kind of a note or anything like that. Her car was in the garage. I said, well, Dale, she didn't walk. She never walked anywhere. She always drove her car. How do you think she left? And he said, well, somebody must have picked her up. She took her purse, she had her phone, she had her makeup bag, and her curling iron.
I called my brother and had him look at the cameras. He came to the office because at the time he worked there, and he looked through all of the cameras. So on the exterior of the house, the inside of the office, all around the buildings, just to see who was there, at what times, and what they were doing. And there was nothing with her. You couldn't find her at all. By 5 or 6 o'clock that night, my siblings all decided that it would be a good idea to contact the police, so we made our missing persons report.
My name is Troy Bevere. I'm the sheriff of Lenawee County, investigating the disappearance of Dee Warner. So our deputy responded out to the location to take a missing person report. The deputy did talk to Dale initially, and the information that Dale gave to the deputy was that she just took off. And our deputy had some concerns, and that's why the next day the detective was following up on it. What's unusual here, things were not taken that normally were car or other personal items. That really spawned us to start doing more investigation around the home.
I'm 47 years old. I've never known anybody to disappear. Never even knew somebody that disappeared. In fact, we leave our keys in our vehicles. We hardly lock our house.
So news of Dee's disappearance consumed the county. This type of thing just doesn't happen. This was the biggest news to break in this area in years. And so a lot of people had questions about what happened to Dee, where she was, and they were all wanting answers as well.
We reported her missing on a Sunday. They came on a Tuesday to do a big search at the farm with the helicopters, the drones, the dogs. Dale initially gave consent for them to search the farm and the house. But within 2 hours, he revoked consent and told them to leave and come back with a warrant because he needed to go back to work. I just remember listening to him tell me why he did that. And all I keep thinking in my head is, your wife is missing.
We have a lot of farmers in Lenawee County, and there's a lot of farmers that when it's time to farm, it's time to farm, even if someone is missing, whether that's right or wrong. But we continued on with our investigation.
By the time they got their warrant approved and signed by a judge and got themselves gathered together, it was dark when they got back on that evening. And I know that for sure because I was actually farming in a field where I could watch them right next door. It was certainly inhibited by darkness and would not be anywhere near as good a search as they would have done in the daylight when they were there to start with. It's just frustrating, and it's horribly painful for the family.
So we just were waiting, and we kept waiting for something. There has to be something there that proves whatever happened, it felt like I got punched in the gut because it was just nothing. And I just was very confused at why Dale just didn't seem concerned.
At this point, I actually told Dale, "You're the husband, you're the spouse. All eyes are going to be on you."
So that Saturday, she had texted that there was a big fight and that she was very upset with Dale. Dee was definitely the type that if something upset her, I mean, she had no problem telling anybody. She was going to send Angelina somewhere, and I said, well, let her come over and play with her cousin. So she said, okay, and I got there at 7:42, and that was the last that I ever... Her phone was off after that.
That was the day she got in a really bad fight with Dale, her husband. She was ready to end the marriage. She was ready to sell the businesses. She was ready to leave. That was the last time I got to see her.
So from the very beginning, Dale maintained that Dee left on her own accord, possibly to Mexico, Jamaica. Now, the sheriff's office says that this is a possibility, but when we talked to the family, they said this is no way that Dee would just up and leave, especially with a young child.
You start process of elimination, and the first one to get eliminated was actually someone picking her up. I contacted all of her friends. All of them were extremely surprised about what I was telling them about Dee's disappearance. We had no one that could have, quote unquote, picked up Dee, given her a ride.
So as we respond to a missing person report, you let the facts send you in the direction that you need to go in. So as you're getting that information, you want to make sure that you're asking things like, did they take a particular credit card? So that you can look at bank accounts.
There's no bank activity. You can't go MIA and not have availability to funds, to money.
My sister, respectfully, she was high maintenance, okay? So her lifestyle wasn't going to, live in the woods in some tent. So she would have had to have money, and she would have had to have a lot of it. The probability of her leaving him a wedding ring that was sizable is flat zero. That would have been an easy thing to generate cash by. We had many concerns when she went missing. Dee wasn't a person who would go hide and not say anything. She was a communicator.
The information that we really had from the family, and it made sense, was she would never not get in touch with them. It was clear after the facts started to come out that finding the truth about what happened to Dee would be a little more difficult than we had initially thought.
It wasn't unusual that she might have wanted to get away because of a fight with her husband, but it was the circumstances around how she left. No car, no daughter, no contact, no nothing. And so I was concerned about how she may have harmed herself. We had a community search that took place on the Saturday after she went missing. There were 40 or 50 people that spent hours walking the property, looking for a body because of a potential suicide. Early in the spring, there was no foliage or anything like that, so everything was pretty visible at that time. We walked the property, looked all over, and couldn't find any evidence whatsoever. And then in addition to that, and during that week, I had been speaking to experts in criminal psychology and in psychology and psychiatry, talking about how does a woman commit suicide? And it became very obvious that that wasn't a possibility.
She did not have the capability to leave Angelina, or she does not have the capability to put anybody else through this hurt. There's no way possible that she would hurt any of us this bad. She didn't have it in her. She wouldn't leave us wondering what happened. She wouldn't do this to her kids. She wouldn't do this to her grandkids.
The goose in the house, bathe in the starlight, and cover.
So we instantly began investigating that toxic relationship between my sister and Mr. Warner.
So that Saturday, when I was there picking up Angelina, Dale pulled in. And when she saw him, she acted afraid, like she wanted to run from the door. I've seen Dee upset many times, but this was on a whole different level of being upset.
She never ever expressed anything to me about being scared of him until the day before she went missing. By the end of our conversation, she kind of randomly just said, I watch Dateline like every night, and he could do something like that to me.
I definitely have a lot of regret not staying or not taking her with me or making sure she left the house.
For me, the most bizarre was Dale's total lack of concern, his total lack of emotion, his total demeanor about, I just want to get my life normal and go on, was, in my opinion, more impactful than sending the search party away.
When the investigation started, the lead detective pretty much spelled it out for Dale. You're the husband. You're the last person that saw her. You are going to be the person that everybody focuses on, including us.
My name is Larry Lieb. I'm an attorney here in Michigan. Maybe 2 or 3 days after Dee went missing, I got a call from Dale and I agreed to represent him. It is a bizarre situation. I don't even want to call it a case. I think it's really a situation. There's been no evidence whatsoever that connects him or anybody close to him to her disappearance.
Early on, Dee's family, they were suspicious of Dale. But those that support Dale say that there could have been other theories. So as part of our reporting, we did find that Dee had an argument with an employee just a few days before her disappearance.
I understand that Dee was a difficult person to work with, and somebody specific didn't care for her.
You're going to ruffle some feathers and you're going to step on some toes when you're in business. You can't possibly please everybody.
She got in a really bad fight with a couple employees, and she was really, really upset.
So we were shown a text message that Dee received just a few days before her disappearance. That text was sent by someone who was close with the employee that Dee got into that argument with. The text message was pretty nasty. It was rude and insulting, called her a mess, even alleging that she was taking anti-anxiety medication. So this text raised a lot of red flags, and a lot of people were wondering, did this play a role in Dee's disappearance? The Lenawee County Sheriff's Office has not made any comment about these text messages, so it definitely has a lot more questions than answers when it comes to those text messages. Dee's family thinks that she handled the business well, so the fact that she would have any sort of violence within the workplace is something that her family definitely does not think would happen.
I never really had any concern for her safety with the employees. I felt like she had a pretty strong bond with most of them. Most of her employees have worked for her for a long time. So in August of 21, Dale called my spouse, Dustin. He had something that he thought we needed to see. I, of course, was ready for something. So we went over there and he hands me this 3-page letter in my mom's handwriting. Dale said that he found it about a week after she disappeared. And he just gave it to the sheriff's department. Why are you just now handing that over? On this letter, it talked about how much my mom loved him and how she worked so hard for him to be happy, and she just couldn't make him happy. It didn't talk about that she was leaving. And then it kind of abruptly ended with no signature, nothing. I took pictures of this letter and I sent it to my siblings. And my brother said, I know that this letter isn't recent. She wrote this letter a couple of years ago. It was very strange. And that was when I realized he's manipulating me to think that she took off on us. And I know that's not true.
So in October 2021, I was called out on breaking news that FBI agents were at the property of Dale and Dee Warner. When we arrived on scene, we saw the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office there, Michigan State Police, along with the FBI, and they had crime scene tape up around the entire area. We definitely knew something big was either happening or about to happen with the amount of authorities that were on scene.
In October, we actually had the opportunity to bring in the FBI. They had a lot of resources and a lot of agents. We brought in sonar penetrating devices so we could search the ground.
Law enforcement agencies, including the Lenawee County Sheriff's Department, Michigan State Police, and even the FBI were involved in today's search, which included looking through acres of property on the Warner's farm and excavating a nearby field.
Excavators, dogs, everything. Lumen all the house. I sat on my lawn with my family, my brothers, and watched them dig in the field right next to my house. We did not get warned that that was happening. Watching them dig was a mix of emotions. I wanted an answer so bad. I wanted this to end so bad that I didn't care what it was that they found. I want my mom to be alive. But I know that my mom would never leave us.
Bevere tells us there are no new leads after today's search and no persons of interest. The Lenawee County Sheriff's Office says they are working to solve this case for her family.
We were able to rule out some things, but we were also able to get some things that I'm really not going to be able to comment on because it is an active investigation.
The emotions I was feeling was hope that there was going to be some end to this. But there wasn't. It was just another letdown.
I don't want to sound ungrateful. I'm very grateful that they did it, but it fell into that category too little, too late.
They have searched his home multiple times. They've searched his office. They've searched his warehouse. They've searched the fields. The FBI came in and dug up the fields. They used sonar to try to find any evidence they possibly can. They've downloaded all the security cameras. They've downloaded his cell phones. They've downloaded the computers. I mean, they have done everything that they could possibly do to try to find some evidence, but they haven't found anything.
So about 7 months after Dee disappeared, her family getting very frustrated with how the investigation's being handled with the Lenawee County Sheriff's Office, that's when they decided to essentially take things into their own hands, and they formed a vigil for Dee at her brother's property, Greg Hardy. And they were hoping that it would help spread the word about her disappearance and really encourage people who might know something to come forward.
I'd like to start out by saying thank you all very, very much. It's been truly amazing how many people have participated in trying to find Dee.
It was this past fall when the vigil was organized. People were at the point where they just wanted to do something, very frustrated by nothing happening.
Anything that we can possibly do to keep making people aware so that they can share. And I think Dale has done nothing to spread awareness that she's been missing. We've had vigils and he has not come to any of them. He's had yard signs put in his yard. He's taken them down immediately. He has not spoke to any of the press.
Dale not only not participate by attending a vigil, he did not ever participate in helping organize one or organizing any kind of an event that a normal husband would do to try to help find his missing wife. So his demeanor was totally suspicious about everything.
I asked him if he had attended any of the vigils or any of that. And A, he'd never been invited by any of her family. And second of all, we're in a small town. All the fingers are pointed at him. Dale wants to believe that she's still alive and is constantly telling Angelina, Mommy's on a break and she'll come back. I think that he wants to display that sense of confidence to his daughter.
Nearly a year after Dee went missing, her family reached out to a private investigator for help, attorney Billy Little. And what makes him such a key part of this is that he has extensive experience when it comes to murder investigations, not only with his private practice, but also in the military.
We were at somewhat of a standstill, actually, with the investigation. The authorities weren't getting anywhere with the process, or they weren't getting there with any speed. The lack of transparency, the lack of accountability to the family, in my opinion, has been very frustrating, to say the least. My wife had actually seen a television program where Billy Little helped an investigation. It was impressionable enough on me. I asked my wife if she could find this guy, and I called him.
I remember the first time that I met Billy Little, I got in my car and I cried after I talked to him because I was happy. They were tears of joy and tears of, we're gonna get help. This is the man that is gonna help us. This is the man that's gonna get us answers. He is very determined. He said, just very matter-of-factly, very confidently said, I don't lose. I've got him.
Deanne Warner was last seen April 25th, 2021. If you have any information, please contact the Michigan State Police at 855-642-4847.
My name is Billy Little. I'm an investigative attorney. I've been invited by the family to help find out what happened to Dee Warner. When I come on a case, it is a fire hose of information, hundreds of hours of interviews that I've recorded, and thousands of pages of documents, and I have to sift through that. And then you start to find things, and the pieces start to come together, and you start to think, okay, here we go. Now we got something.
Like any other county, any other police agency, we have other things that we're investigating. It's a tough thing because you want to be there for the family. You want to be there for Dee, and we want to find the truth. And if a private investigator helps to get to the truth, then we welcome that because it's all for the family. It really is.
Investigating a missing person is a process of elimination. Dale started throwing out stories about, well, she had this wealthy friend who had a private jet, that she went to Mexico, that she went to Jamaica. I started looking at that, looking for this friend. If she did go to Mexico, how did she do it? Did she withdraw money out of the bank before she went? Were there any financial transactions after she left? Any credit card usage? Any phones? Any crossing of borders?
You know, she loved to travel, so Dale made the suggestion that maybe she's in Mexico or Jamaica. Sometimes people want to get away and they want to start a new life. We just don't know.
For her to go to Mexico, go to Jamaica, no. You have to have money. This is not something that you just pick up and take off and do. You have to have a plan. Don't get me wrong, she's a smart woman, but it would take a very, very smart person just to literally drop off the face of the earth with no communication.
But there's no evidence, there's no cars missing, there's no luggage missing. One by one, things are not adding up.
So early in our reporting, we learned that Dee and Dale Warner, they were well off. They both had successful businesses. They were doing well. Dee owned that trucking company. Dale had the agriculture business. It seemed important to look into their finances and to see if that maybe played a role in Dee's disappearance.
Dee ran this very profitable trucking company. When she went missing, the assets began being bled off, stolen. Over $1 million has been taken from that business. Dale started a new business called DDW Transportation and just transferred all the assets over there. How can you possibly transfer assets when you don't own them, which is what Dale was doing? Dale produced this power of attorney that was signed back in 2014, allegedly. And the document was clearly not Dee's signature. Any layperson could have looked at it and seen that. But the document was sent to a qualified handwriting analysis examiner that came up with an expert opinion that that absolutely was not her signature on a power of attorney. Why would a person produce a forged power of attorney? Especially when you say she's coming back. If she is coming back, she sure as heck is going to know that that's a forged power of attorney.
Well, there were certainly questions about Dale's involvement in Dee's businesses, and there were other troubling factors about their relationship that were starting to come to light.
There are a lot of things about Dale's behavior that are bizarre. He had the need to know everything about her. He had the need to control her, to make her do what he wanted her to do. In order to do that, he's got to monitor what she's saying, what she's doing. And so part of that was he would hide his iPad in the office in the slots where files would be kept on a desk. She would have conversations in her office, and she would say, and she would point to the recording device and then whisper to that person, "We're being recorded."
Dee had often told me that she was being recorded, that she would find iPads in odd places in the office and that the red light was on, which means, you know, that it's being recorded. It's eerily odd. There's been several times where we would be out to eat and all of a sudden Dale would show up and sit in a booth right by us. So there was no privacy. Just very odd. To say that it's coincidental would be an understatement.
Dale was showing up places that she was at, dinner, parties, and being possessive to her. In July of 2020, my mom mentioned finding something in her car. She thought it was very strange. Dustin, my spouse, said, "Go get it and show me." So she went out to her car and brought it in. She just laid it on the counter and he looked it up, and it was a tracking device. My mom was going to confront him, and when she did, he said he didn't know what it was.
The idea that there was a tracker on Dee's car, I just want to address that real quickly. That tracker was only for security purposes. They have sort of suggested that Dale was somehow following her. None of that's true. That tracker was only for the purposes of if the car was stolen. So in a small town, you never know.
I don't find that this particular county is a hotbed for stolen cars, and the only tracking device was put on Dee's car, not the other cars. There are millions of dollars worth of equipment up there that don't have this tracking device. And if it was truly to find a stolen vehicle, he would have no reason to hide that from her. This is an element of control, an element of abuse, an element of stalking. He's monitoring her phone. He's recording her surreptitiously. He is very concerned about everything that she's doing until she goes missing. All of a sudden, not concerned about where she is, not trying to find her. In March of 2022, a witness gave us information. Who that witness is, I can't reveal at this point. I believe that I can prove Dale's alibi is a lie. Dale's statement that they were asleep and he left at 6 a.m. I know without any doubt that is false. On the night of April 24th, I know where he was, I know what he was doing. Dale was absolutely not at home sleeping. I received information on the Sunday when Dee disappeared that between 3 and 4:30 a.m. that morning, Dale left his home. Dale was at his father's farm at 3:55 a.m. He was seen by a witness going into the office, getting the keys for the chemical and equipment barn. When he was seen by witnesses, he was in a hurry. He didn't address anybody. He didn't look at anybody. He was completely different than he had behaved in prior times when they had seen him. In my opinion, Dale went to his father's place to try to dispose of Dee's body.
You know, the night that she went missing, Dale was wearing his Apple Watch, and it was connected to his Apple phone. And it was not a pulse that was raised. His disposition was of a normal person sleeping. Got up to go to work at 6:30 in the morning, saw his wife laying on the couch, and went to work.
Neither Dale nor his attorney have shared the Apple Watch data with us, and we have requested that, and we would be happy to look at it, happy to have some independent experts look at it. But I've turned over a great deal of information to the police.
The Lenawee County Sheriff's Office has named Deanne Warner's husband a person of interest in her disappearance.
Her family pointing a finger at Warner's husband, Dale Warner, in connection to her disappearance. However, the Lucas County Sheriff's Office has not named a suspect in the case, instead calling Dale Warner a person of interest.
The only difference between a person of interest and a suspect is a suspect, you have a crime and it's been labeled a crime. In this situation, we have a missing person. Although the longer that missing person case goes, we'll see what happens as far as developing into something else.
For me, personally, it's hard to imagine why that person wouldn't be considered a suspect.
It definitely put a divide in the county on who was on whose side. So many people went straight to thinking that Dale may have been responsible for Dee's disappearance. But at this point, the Sheriff's Office really hasn't commented much about where they stand on their investigation. And we could see the frustration building with the family. But Dale and his attorneys still maintain his innocence. They say that he has cooperated with authorities, and they still say that Dee left on her own accord.
Dale really truly believes that over the course of a period of years, she planned her exit. I think that she set herself up when he went to work to avoid the security cameras, and she left. She knew where she was going, and she knew she wanted to start fresh. And that's the reason why you haven't found any evidence whatsoever of her demise. We hope she's okay, but to this point, there's no evidence to suggest he did anything or anybody close to him did anything to assist in her disappearance.
The best case scenario, I would hope that she is somewhere like Fiji, sitting on the beach, having a drink, living life to the fullest. I would love to just be mad at her instead of mourn her. But sadly, she is also the type of person and the type of mother that could never put people through this amount of hurt and this amount of pain.
The goose in the heavens, bathed in the starlight, and covered.
This is raw, and it's real, and it's true. I constantly wonder what happened and where she's at.
I can say that the Sheriff's Office, state police, and the FBI, we will continue to work on this until we can get closure. We're not going to give up until we have the truth.
The reality is this. There was only one person at the house on the evening that my sister disappeared. She didn't just vaporize, and that one person knows where she's at now. Everybody who's involved in my sister's death needs to pay the price. The final goal of here would be to see someone in prison.
I 100% think that Dale is responsible for what happened to my mom.
The house stood silent again, just as it had that December afternoon, the gates closed, the manicured hedges perfectly trimmed, palm fronds barely stirring in the humid air of Boca Raton, a city that prided itself on order, wealth, and the illusion of safety. Detectives returned to the scene over and over in the months that followed, replaying timelines in their heads, reconstructing movements down to the minute, asking the same question that refused to die. How does a killer slip into a guarded community in broad daylight, commit a brutal murder, and vanish without leaving a trace strong enough to follow? Inside, the forensic teams had mapped everything. Blood spatter patterns, footwear impressions, fibers, latent prints that didn't match anyone in the system. The victim, Jill Halliburton Sue, had been attacked in her own home, in a neighborhood where residents paid a premium for privacy and protection. There were no signs of forced entry at the main door. No shattered windows. No alarm triggered in time to stop what happened. Just violence, sudden and overwhelming, in a place that was supposed to be untouchable. Police canvassed the gated community relentlessly. Security guards were questioned again and again. Delivery drivers, landscapers, contractors, anyone who had passed through those iron gates in the days leading up to the murder. Logs were checked for inconsistencies. Handwriting scrutinized. Entry times compared against surveillance footage that was grainy, incomplete, frustrating. The cameras covered the entrances, but not every driveway, not every blind spot between trimmed hedges and quiet cul-de-sacs. Rumors began to spread almost immediately. Inside job. Targeted attack. Random predator. Theories multiplied faster than evidence. Some whispered about robbery gone wrong, pointing to missing jewelry. Others insisted it had to be personal. The level of violence, they said, suggested rage. But investigators were careful, methodical. They refused to let speculation steer the case. They focused on what they had: DNA, trace evidence, fragments of a stranger left behind in a house that did not belong to him. The media descended quickly. Headlines flashed across local broadcasts: gated community murder, wealthy enclave shaken, cold case in the making. Reporters stood outside the neighborhood entrance, microphones raised, voices urgent. Residents avoided eye contact, retreating behind tinted car windows and guarded statements. Fear seeped into conversations at country clubs and grocery stores. If it could happen here, people asked, where was safe? Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Detectives followed leads that flared bright and then fizzled into nothing. A suspicious man seen walking along the perimeter wall, identified, cleared. A former employee with a grudge, interviewed, alibi confirmed. A drifter picked up miles away, DNA didn't match. Each possibility carried hope for a moment, then collapsed under scrutiny. The DNA profile recovered from the scene became the center of the investigation. It was clear, strong, undeniable. The killer had left himself behind at a molecular level. But when entered into CODIS, the national database, the result came back the same way every time: no match. No prior arrest. No record. The man who committed the crime was invisible to the system. And that invisibility was maddening. Detectives expanded outward, checking neighboring counties, reviewing unsolved burglaries, sexual assaults, home invasions. They searched for patterns, similar entry methods, similar victim profiles. There were cases, yes, but none aligned cleanly. Nothing that locked into place with certainty. The killer did not fit neatly into an existing category. He was a ghost moving through statistics, without leaving a signature that screamed repeat offender. Meanwhile, the family grieved under a spotlight they never asked for. Public appeals were made. Rewards offered. Tips flooded in, hundreds of them. Some detailed, some delusional, many contradictory. Each one had to be logged, evaluated, chased down. Investigators worked long hours chasing shadows, aware that time was already beginning to erode memory. Witnesses forget. Details blur. Certainty dissolves. The case file grew thicker. Photographs sealed in evidence bags. Interview transcripts stacked in binders. Forensic reports annotated and re-annotated. But thick files do not equal progress. They equal weight. By the end of the first year, the language shifted. Active investigation slowly began to share space with another phrase, cold case. It wasn't announced formally. It seeped in quietly, in off-the-record conversations, in the tone of press conferences that offered fewer updates and more reassurances. Behind closed doors, detectives refused to give up. They re-walked the property. Re-examined the timeline. They considered the possibility that the killer had studied the neighborhood, learned guard routines, observed residents' schedules. It wasn't random, some argued. It felt calculated. The timing suggested knowledge. The confidence inside the home suggested familiarity with risk. But calculated by whom? The idea of a transient criminal passing through remained plausible. Interstate highways cut through South Florida like veins, carrying thousands of vehicles every day. A man could drive in, blend in, drive out, disappear into another state before anyone realized what had happened. That possibility haunted the task force. If he wasn't local, the chances of recognition dropped dramatically. Years slipped by. Technology evolved. Forensic science advanced. Cold cases across the country began reopening under new light, new testing methods, improved DNA analysis, digital record cross-referencing. The evidence from Boca Raton was preserved carefully, almost reverently. Detectives who retired passed the case to younger officers with quiet urgency. Don't let this die. The community changed too. New families moved into the neighborhood. Old residents sold their homes, unable to shake the memory. Children who had been in elementary school when the murder happened grew into adults, who only vaguely remembered the shock that once dominated local headlines. But for those directly affected, the clock never reset. Every few years, the case resurfaced in the media. Anniversaries brought renewed attention. Still unsolved. Family seeks answers. Each article reopened wounds, but also reignited hope. Maybe someone would remember something they once dismissed as insignificant. Maybe guilt would crack someone's silence. Detectives revisited the DNA profile again and again as databases expanded. Each time, the answer remained the same: no direct hit. The killer had never been arrested for a qualifying offense. He moved through society clean on paper. And yet he existed. Somewhere, he aged. He built a life. He may have married, had children, held a steady job. All while carrying the memory of what he had done inside that quiet house in Boca Raton. That thought unsettled investigators more than the crime itself. Because it meant the monster wasn't lurking in alleyways. He was blending in at barbecues, standing in grocery lines, nodding politely at neighbors. Ordinary on the outside. Unimaginable beneath. The passage of time did not dull the brutality of the act. If anything, it sharpened it. A murder unsolved becomes heavier with each passing year. It transforms from tragedy into symbol, a reminder that even wealth and security cannot seal every crack. Cold case. 2 words. Heavy. Final. But not dead. In the evidence locker, sealed and catalogued, the DNA waited. Silent. Patient. A code without a name. And somewhere beyond the manicured lawns and guarded gates of Boca Raton, the man who left it behind continued to breathe, unaware that science was inching forward, that the very thing that made him invisible might one day betray him, that the silence he relied on was not permanent but temporary, stretched thin across years that were slowly running out, time does something dangerous to a case like this. It makes people believe it belongs to the past. But inside the evidence vault in Boca Raton, the past was not buried. It was sealed in paper envelopes, frozen in swabs, catalogued in digital files that refused to disappear. The name Jill Halliburton, Sue, did not fade inside those walls. It echoed. Quiet. Persistent. Unresolved. By year 5, the investigation had shifted from urgency to endurance. The original detectives had memorized every square foot of the house, every timestamp, every contradiction in witness statements. New investigators entered the room like fresh blood stepping into a long war. They studied the files the way archaeologists study ruins, searching for patterns buried beneath assumptions. Fresh eyes. New theories. Same haunting question. The DNA remained the center of gravity. Back in 2002, forensic science had already been powerful. But now it was evolving at a pace that felt almost cinematic. STR analysis had become sharper. Touch DNA testing improved. Samples once considered too small were suddenly viable. The evidence from the crime scene was carefully retested, reprocessed, amplified again. Each time, the same male profile emerged, consistent, solid, undeniable. And still no match in CODIS. No criminal history. No prior felony. No obvious database entry. Whoever had killed inside that gated home had managed to live outside the system. That realization changed the tone of the investigation. Detectives stopped assuming they were hunting a career criminal. They began considering something more unsettling. What if this was a man who had never been caught for anything before or after? A one-time explosion of violence. A man who blended seamlessly into society. A neighbor. A contractor. A passerby who never raised suspicion. They revisited the gated community logs again, combing through entry records that were now yellowing with age. Security at the time had been considered tight. Vehicles logged. Visitors recorded. But tight is not airtight. Guards rotate. Paper logs can be sloppy. A name can be misspelled. A license plate misread. Investigators digitized the records, cross-referencing names with state databases. Some leads sparked briefly, individuals with minor criminal records, men who had moved out of state shortly after 2002, workers whose employment histories had gaps. Each one was tracked down. Interviewed. Eliminated through alibi or DNA comparison. Each elimination narrowed the field, but also deepened the mystery. If not them, then who? The theory of a burglary gone wrong still lingered, but something about the scene never felt entirely random. The level of force. The way the attack unfolded. It suggested proximity, confrontation, intensity. Detectives reconstructed the likely sequence of events again and again, narrating it in low voices over crime scene photographs. Entry. Movement. Encounter. Violence. Exit. It was swift. Controlled. Then gone. National headlines occasionally revisited the case, framing it as emblematic of a larger fear, violence invading privilege. The narrative was irresistible to the media, wealth, exclusivity, a gated community breached. But for investigators, the glamour meant nothing. They were chasing a single human being, not a headline. By the 10th anniversary, the term cold case was no longer whispered. It was printed boldly in articles. It was spoken plainly in interviews. The task force had thinned. Budgets shifted to newer crimes demanding immediate answers. Yet one or two detectives remained tethered to the file, driven not by media pressure, but by unfinished business. Around this time, a new idea began circulating quietly in law enforcement circles across the country: investigative genetic genealogy. The concept sounded radical at first, using public DNA databases, the kind people use to trace ancestry, to identify unknown suspects through family connections. Instead of waiting for the killer himself to enter CODIS, investigators could potentially find a distant cousin who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA to a genealogy website. It wasn't mainstream yet. It wasn't routine. It was experimental, controversial, legally complex. But it represented something the Boca Raton case desperately needed: a new direction. The evidence was re-examined with this possibility in mind. The DNA profile was strong enough, clean enough. The question was whether it could be adapted for genealogical comparison. Specialists were consulted. Labs were contacted. The process would be expensive, time-consuming, and there was no guarantee of success. Meanwhile, life outside the investigation continued. Children grew up. Houses were renovated. The neighborhood regained its polished calm. But under the surface, the memory lingered like a hairline crack in glass. Residents still referenced the year in hushed tones. Real estate agents still fielded questions from buyers who had done their research. The murder had become part of the area's history, an uncomfortable footnote that refused to be erased. Inside the department, the case file became almost mythic. Younger officers heard about it in training sessions. The unsolved murder inside a gated community. The DNA with no name. It was a reminder that even with resources, technology, and determination, justice could stall. Then came a turning point, subtle at first. A decision was made to pursue the genealogical route. The DNA profile was converted, expanded into a format compatible with ancestry databases. Legal teams reviewed privacy implications. Warrants were drafted. The evidence, preserved for years with meticulous care, was finally entering a new arena, one where family trees, not criminal records, might hold the key. When the data was uploaded and compared, the initial results did not produce a direct match. No flashing red alert. No instant identification. Instead, there were distant connections, third cousins, fourth cousins, fragments of shared genetic markers scattered across anonymous profiles. To some, it looked like nothing. To trained genealogists, it looked like a map. Family trees began to form on whiteboards. Branches extended backward through decades, connecting surnames, marriages, relocations. Investigators worked alongside genetic experts, tracing common ancestors, narrowing geographic clusters. It was painstaking work, part science, part detective craft. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Several of the distant matches traced back to a particular region. A particular family line. Names began repeating. A surname surfaced more than once. Detectives felt something they hadn't felt in years: momentum. The family tree narrowed to a manageable list of male descendants, who would have been adults in 2002. Addresses were pulled. Employment histories reviewed. Some had airtight alibis, or were living in other states at the time. Others required closer scrutiny. One name stood out. Not because of a criminal record, there wasn't one. Not because of notoriety, he had none. But because his age, location, and timeline aligned in a way that made investigators pause. He had lived within driving distance of Boca Raton in 2002. He had no significant criminal history. He had moved quietly through life, changing jobs, relocating occasionally, but never triggering attention. Surveillance began discreetly. Trash pulls were conducted, legally and quietly, retrieving discarded items that might carry DNA, a coffee cup, a tissue, a soda can. Each item was sent to the lab with the kind of anticipation detectives rarely allowed themselves anymore. The waiting was excruciating. Years of silence had taught them not to expect miracles. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of something long dormant, something that might finally crack open. And as the lab technicians processed the samples, as machines whirred and sequences aligned, one truth hovered in the air like static. If the DNA matched, the ghost who had haunted Boca Raton since 2002 would finally have a name, a face, the door detectives could knock on. If it didn't, the case would slip back into the cold, heavier than ever, burdened by another failed attempt. The community slept peacefully, unaware that science and patience were converging behind the scenes, that the silent code left behind in a quiet house decades earlier was closer than ever to speaking, and that the illusion of permanence, the illusion that some crimes remain forever unsolved, was beginning to fracture under the weight of relentless pursuit. The call from the lab did not come with fanfare. It came quietly, clinically, almost casually, but the words inside it detonated like a controlled explosion after 20 years of silence. The DNA from the discarded cup matched the profile preserved from the crime scene. Not a partial. Not a statistical maybe. A direct, conclusive match. The ghost had a body. The body had a name. In a conference room inside the police department in Boca Raton, detectives stared at the report as if it might evaporate. 2 decades of stalled progress reduced to a single line of confirmation. The genetic code recovered from inside the home of Jill Halliburton, Sue belonged to a man who had lived undetected in plain sight. No criminal history that would have flagged him. No prior felony. No prison record. Just an ordinary existence layered over an extraordinary secret. His name circulated around the table for the first time. Not in a whisper of speculation. Not as a theory. As fact. The man they had surveilled, the man whose trash had been quietly collected from the curb under cover of early morning darkness, had carried the same DNA as the unknown profile sealed in evidence for 20 years. The invisible intruder was invisible no more. But even with the match, nothing could be rushed. Detectives moved carefully, methodically, aware that one misstep could unravel everything. They reviewed the genealogical pathway that had led them here, documenting each branch of the family tree, ensuring legal integrity. Warrants were drafted. Prosecutors were briefed. Every detail from 2002 was re-examined with fresh urgency. What had he been doing that day? Where had he worked? Who had he known in Boca Raton? The timeline was reconstructed again, but this time with a suspect in focus rather than a faceless silhouette. Records showed he had been living in Florida at the time of the murder. Not in the gated community. Not in the immediate neighborhood. But close enough. Close enough to drive in and out without attracting attention. Close enough to study routines if he had wanted to. Close enough to vanish into the broader landscape of South Florida highways. Investigators dug into his employment history. Construction-related jobs. Temporary contracts. Physical labor. Work that could place a man inside gated communities without raising suspicion. Work that would explain familiarity with layouts, with access points, with the casual trust extended to uniformed workers carrying tools. Neighbors from his past were quietly interviewed. Most described him the same way, quiet, reserved, polite. Nothing alarming. Nothing memorable. He kept to himself. Paid bills on time. No loud arguments. No police visits. A background so unremarkable it was almost strategic. That ordinariness felt like an insult. Because in December 2002, someone had entered a home and committed an act of violence that shattered a family and unsettled a city. And for 20 years, the man now sitting at the center of the file had walked through life untouched by suspicion. Detectives replayed the crime scene photos again, this time with his face in mind. The evidence did not change, but its weight did. The DNA was no longer abstract. It was his. His cells. His skin. His presence inside that house. The arrest plan was drawn with precision. There would be no spectacle. No early leaks. No chance for him to flee. Surveillance tightened. Movements logged. Vehicles tracked. Officers prepared to move swiftly once warrants were signed. In the days leading up to the arrest, there was a tension inside the department that felt almost electric. Veterans who had started their careers on this case felt something close to disbelief. Younger officers, who had grown up hearing about it as a cautionary tale of unfinished justice, now stood on the brink of witnessing its reversal. When the arrest finally came, it was swift. Controlled. The man was taken into custody without dramatic resistance. No high-speed chase. No barricaded standoff. Just handcuffs clicking shut in a moment that should have happened 20 years earlier. News broke within hours. 2002 Boca Raton murder solved. DNA genealogy leads to arrest. Headlines erupted across Florida and beyond. The phrase, "cold case cracked," flashed across television screens. Reporters once again gathered outside the gates of the same community, their microphones raised as if time had folded in on itself. For residents who remembered that winter day, the shock was visceral. Some felt relief. Others felt something more complicated, a realization that the killer had been living among them, breathing the same humid air, shopping in the same stores, existing quietly while the case gathered dust in public perception. Inside interrogation rooms, detectives faced the man whose DNA had betrayed him. They laid out the evidence piece by piece. The genealogical trail. The surveillance. The lab match. There was no theatrical confession in the first moments. No cinematic breakdown. Just the slow tightening of inevitability, as science closed the circle he had assumed would remain open forever. Prosecutors prepared for trial, fully aware that a case 2 decades old carries challenges. Memories fade. Witnesses relocate. Some die. Physical evidence becomes sacred because it cannot lie. The DNA would be central. The preservation of the crime scene meticulous enough to withstand scrutiny. The genealogical process transparent enough to survive legal attack. The defense would question methods. Privacy. The reach of ancestry databases. They would scrutinize every step that connected distant cousins to the man now sitting in custody. But the DNA from the discarded cup did not argue. It aligned. It matched the profile from the scene with statistical certainty that left little room for doubt. For the family of Jill Halliburton Sue, the arrest was not a restoration of what was lost. It was not closure in the simplistic sense. It was something heavier, more complicated, the knowledge that the man responsible had finally been named, that the silence surrounding the crime had been pierced by truth. The gated community, once defined by shock and fear, now found itself defined by something else, endurance. The case that had lingered as an open wound for 20 years had finally moved forward. Not because someone suddenly remembered a detail. Not because a tipster emerged from the shadows. But because science had advanced far enough to reach back into the past and extract a name from anonymity. And yet, beneath the headlines and the relief, there remained an unsettling truth. For 2 decades, the killer had lived freely. He had watched years pass. He had seen technology evolve. He had likely believed that the absence of a match in 2002 guaranteed permanent safety. That if he had avoided arrest long enough, he had escaped. But time, which once protected him, had ultimately betrayed him. The DNA he left behind in a moment of violence did not decay. It waited. Silent. Patient. It followed him invisibly through marriages, jobs, relocations, until one day it was compared not to his own record, but to the distant echo of a cousin curious about ancestry. A family tree became a roadmap. A roadmap became surveillance. Surveillance became a discarded cup. And a discarded cup became the final thread tying him irrevocably to a house in Boca Raton where a life had been taken. As the case moved toward trial, the community felt the weight of history shifting. The phrase unsolved no longer applied. The word cold thawed under courtroom lights. But the memory of the crime, the shock of that December day, would never fully disappear. Because even when a cold case is cracked, even when handcuffs close and charges are filed, the years that were stolen cannot be restored. The fear that once rippled through quiet streets cannot be erased. Justice may arrive late, but it does not rewind time. And in the stillness of that gated neighborhood, behind iron gates that once promised security, there lingered a lesson etched deeper than any headline, that silence is not safety, that secrets can outlive decades, and that somewhere inside a sealed evidence envelope, the truth can wait longer than any man expects. Courtrooms are not built for ghosts, but this one would have to hold 20 years of one. The air inside the Palm Beach County Courthouse felt heavy the morning proceedings began, cameras lining the steps, reporters speaking in urgent tones, the words "cold case cracked" echoing again and again, as if repetition could compress 2 decades into a headline. Inside, beneath fluorescent lights and polished wood, the name Jill Halliburton Sue was spoken formally, legally, attached to counts and statutes, and the measured cadence of the court. The defendant sat at the table in a pressed shirt, hair grayer now than it had been in 2002, posture stiff but composed. If a stranger walked in without context, they might have seen nothing extraordinary, just another man awaiting trial. That ordinariness was the most jarring part. No visible mark of violence. No dramatic scarlet letter. Just a quiet face that, according to science, had been inside a home in Boca Raton on a December afternoon and left behind a genetic fingerprint that refused to fade. Prosecutors opened with precision. They did not rely on spectacle. They relied on time. On preservation. On the chain of custody that had guarded the DNA profile since 2002. Jurors listened as forensic experts explained how the sample had been collected, sealed, catalogued. How it had been entered into CODIS with no match. How it had waited. How investigative genetic genealogy had opened a new path when traditional databases had failed. The science was laid out carefully, step by step, as if constructing a bridge across 2 decades. The genealogy experts described building family trees from distant matches, tracing lines through great-grandparents, narrowing descendants, identifying male candidates who fit the age range. They described surveillance. The discarded cup. The extraction of DNA from trash left on a curb. The direct comparison. The match. Numbers were shown. Statistical probabilities calculated to astronomical odds. The likelihood of the DNA belonging to anyone other than the defendant was described as infinitesimal. The room felt smaller with each explanation, as if mathematics itself were tightening around the man at the defense table. But trials are not only about science. They are about narrative. The defense worked to introduce doubt, not about the presence of DNA alone, but about context. They questioned how it was left behind. They suggested alternative scenarios, secondary transfer, contamination, the possibility that their client had been in the home for legitimate reasons. Construction work. Maintenance. A visit unconnected to violence. They probed the genealogy process, raising concerns about privacy, about the reach of law enforcement into ancestry databases. They framed it as a slippery slope, a technological leap that outpaced safeguards. Jurors absorbed it all, eyes moving between attorneys and exhibits projected onto large screens. Crime scene photographs frozen in time, diagrams of the house, charts of genetic markers aligning in perfect symmetry. Witnesses from 2002 took the stand, their memories now filtered through 20 years of living. Some spoke with clarity. Others hesitated, acknowledging the blur that time imposes. Detectives described the early days of the investigation, the shock that rippled through the gated community, the exhaustive canvassing, the tips that led nowhere. They admitted frustration. They admitted the case had gone cold. And then they described the shift, the moment technology caught up with the evidence. The family sat quietly through much of it, their presence a reminder that this was never just a forensic puzzle. For them, 2002 had never been relegated to history. It had remained immediate, raw, unclosed. Outside the courthouse, public reaction was divided between relief and disbelief. Some residents of Boca Raton expressed gratitude that the system had not given up. Others wrestled with the unsettling truth that a man, without a criminal record, had allegedly carried such violence within him. The idea that evil does not always announce itself, does not always accumulate a rap sheet before erupting, lingered like humidity in the Florida air. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution reconstructed the day of the murder once more, but now anchored to a name. They detailed entry points. The timeline window. The confrontation. They emphasized that there was no evidence of prior consent, no indication of a benign visit turned tragic. The DNA placed him there. The violence spoke for itself. When the defendant testified, a decision that carried risk, his voice was steady but restrained. He denied involvement. He suggested coincidence. He claimed he had no memory of ever being inside the victim's home. He pointed to the absence of eyewitnesses placing him at the scene. He leaned heavily on the passage of time, on the erosion of certainty that 2 decades can create. But time, once his shield, had become the prosecution's weapon. Because time had preserved the evidence. Time had expanded databases. Time had enabled genealogical science. Time had not erased the DNA. Closing arguments were delivered with gravity. The prosecution spoke of patience, of relentless pursuit, of justice delayed but not denied. They reminded jurors that the absence of an early match did not equal innocence. It reflected only the limits of technology, in 2002. They urged the jury to focus on what could not be explained away, the genetic code tying the defendant to a brutal act inside a private home. The defense urged caution. They warned against over-reliance on evolving science. They asked jurors to consider whether the state had proven not just presence, but guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They emphasized the absence of motive firmly established, the lack of direct eyewitness identification. Then came deliberation. Hours stretched into days. The courthouse corridors filled with speculation. Commentators debated outcomes. Legal analysts dissected genealogical precedent. The community waited, suspended between 2 decades of unanswered questions and the possibility of resolution. When the verdict was finally read, the room seemed to hold its breath. Words that would define the legacy of the case for generations were spoken in a steady voice. Guilty. The impact was not explosive. It was heavy. A weight shifting from uncertainty to certainty. The defendant remained still as the decision settled over him. The family wept quietly. Detectives, who had spent years chasing a phantom, exchanged glances that held exhaustion more than triumph. Outside, headlines erupted again. Guilty in 2002 Boca Raton murder. Cold case ends in conviction. The narrative arc, that had stretched for 20 years, finally bent toward accountability. But even in conviction, there was no true restoration. The years between 2002 and the present remained untouched. The fear that once gripped a gated community could not be erased retroactively. The life lost could not be returned to December 2002 and set back on its original path. What remained was something quieter but enduring, a demonstration that evidence can outlast silence, that science can reach backward across decades, that anonymity is not permanent. In Boca Raton, behind gates once believed impenetrable, the story had come full circle. A house that had once been defined by violence became part of legal history. A name that had been unknown for 20 years became permanently linked to a crime he thought would fade into obscurity. And long after cameras packed away and headlines moved on, one truth lingered with almost cinematic clarity: the smallest fragment left behind, invisible to the naked eye, microscopic and mute, had carried within it the power to speak across time, to wait patiently through 20 years of denial and distance, and to ensure that a moment of violence in 2002 would not remain buried forever. Sentencing day did not feel triumphant. It felt final. The courtroom was quieter this time, the frenzy of verdict day replaced with a heavy stillness. The man who had once been a nameless profile in a database now stood in shackles, no longer a ghost, no longer a theory. The judge spoke in measured tones about the weight of the crime, about the years of unanswered questions, about the permanence of loss. Words like accountability and justice filled the air, but they did not erase the echo of December 2002. When the sentence was handed down, life, with no possibility of slipping quietly back into anonymity, there was no outburst. No dramatic collapse. Just the quiet mechanics of consequence locking into place. Deputies guided him away. The door closed behind him with a sound that felt almost symbolic, as if 2 decades of tension had finally exhaled. Outside the courthouse in Boca Raton, the sun burned bright against manicured lawns and palm-lined streets, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within brick walls. Reporters delivered live stand-ups, repeating the timeline for viewers: 2002 murder, cold case, DNA genealogy, arrest, conviction. The arc was clean in retrospect. Linear. Almost inevitable. But those who had lived inside the timeline knew better. It had not been clean. It had been jagged. Frustrating. Haunted by uncertainty. For the family of Jill Halliburton Sue, sentencing was not closure in the cinematic sense. It was something more complicated: the end of court dates, the end of speculation, the end of waiting for a legal outcome. Grief does not obey verdicts. It does not shrink in response to prison doors closing. But the absence of a question mark can change its shape. Detectives who had carried the file across decades stood in small clusters outside the courthouse afterward, their expressions less celebratory than reflective. Some had retired and returned for the proceedings, drawn back by unfinished history. Others had inherited the case midway through their careers, learning its details the way one memorizes an old scar. They spoke about technology, about patience, about the fragile line between unsolved and solved. Because the truth was this: for years, the case had been labeled cold. And cold cases develop a mythology. They become cautionary tales, symbols of limitation. They remind law enforcement that not every story resolves neatly. This one had defied that fate, not because of a sudden confession, not because of a miraculous eyewitness, but because science refused to stay still. Investigative genetic genealogy had shifted the landscape. The same tool that people used to trace ancestors and build family trees had become a silent partner in criminal justice. In this case, it had reached through distant cousins, through shared strands of DNA uploaded voluntarily for curiosity, and built a bridge back to a violent act in 2002. The implications stretched beyond one courtroom. Departments across the country watched closely. Other cold cases, long dormant, were reopened with renewed hope. Evidence lockers were revisited. Old swabs retested. Profiles converted for genealogical comparison. The message was clear: time was no longer a guarantee of escape. Yet beneath the technological triumph lay a human truth that felt less celebratory. For 20 years, a man had lived freely after committing a brutal act. He had worked jobs, celebrated holidays, shaken hands, perhaps even laughed at dinner tables, all while a family mourned and a community questioned its safety. The system had eventually caught him, but not before 2 decades had passed. That duality lingered like a shadow even in victory. In the gated community where it all began, life continued with its usual rhythm. Lawns trimmed. Deliveries made. Children riding bikes along quiet streets. New residents moved in, some vaguely aware of the history tied to one address, others completely unaware. Over time, tragedy becomes story, and story becomes background. But those who remembered that December day could still picture the flashing lights against stucco walls, the police tape fluttering in humid air, the sudden collapse of the illusion that gates equal protection. The case had forced a reckoning, security systems upgraded, guard protocols tightened, awareness heightened. And now, years later, it offered another lesson. That evidence, however small, can carry enormous weight. That patience can be as powerful as urgency. That anonymity built on the limitations of old technology is temporary. As the convicted man was transferred into the state prison system, processed and assigned a number, the transformation was stark. From invisible citizen to inmate. From ordinary face in a crowd to a permanent record defined by one act. The irony was almost clinical. He had avoided detection for 20 years by leaving no prior criminal footprint, only to be undone by the very DNA he could not see. Back at the police department, the case file was updated one final time. Status: closed by arrest and conviction. The words looked almost unreal after so long. Detectives who had once stared at the same file labeled open allowed themselves a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. But even closed cases leave residue. There are still questions that never fully resolve: motive, inner logic, the private thoughts of a man who carried a secret across decades. Trials establish guilt. They do not always illuminate why. That mystery lingers, less urgent now, but still present. For the community of Boca Raton, the phrase, 2002 murder, will always trigger a flicker of memory. It is woven into local history, a reminder that violence can pierce even the most insulated environments. But it is also now a reminder that cold does not mean permanent. That justice, however delayed, can still arrive. In quiet moments, perhaps the most striking image is not the arrest, not the verdict, not the sentencing. It is the evidence envelope, sealed in 2002, labeled carefully, stored in climate-controlled stillness. Inside it, microscopic strands of DNA waited patiently, indifferent to passing years, immune to fading memory. They waited while headlines changed. They waited while detectives retired. They waited while technology advanced. And when the world finally caught up, they spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly enough to name the man who believed he had stepped out of history. The gates in Boca Raton still close each evening. The hedges are still trimmed. The streets still quiet. But beneath that calm lies a story of patience, science, and the relentless refusal to let a life be reduced to an unsolved file. A cold case once defined by silence is now defined by persistence. And somewhere in a prison cell, a man who once relied on time as an ally now lives inside it as a sentence, proof that even the longest shadows can eventually be pulled into the light. Years after the sentence was handed down, the case refused to disappear entirely. It lingered in training seminars, in forensic conferences, in quiet conversations between detectives, who understood what it meant to stare at an unsolved file and wonder if it would ever move again. The 2002 murder in Boca Raton had become more than a tragedy, it had become a blueprint. Law enforcement agencies across the country began studying the path that led to conviction. Not the crime itself, that had been sudden, brutal, contained within the walls of a single home, but the method that resurrected it. Investigative genetic genealogy was no longer experimental curiosity. It was operational reality. Departments reopened boxes that had gathered dust. Swabs once tested and archived were sent back to labs for conversion into genealogical profiles. Cold cases that had seemed sealed by time were quietly thawed. Inside conference rooms, experts broke down the Boca Raton timeline like a case study. The original evidence collection. The preservation protocols. The decision to pursue ancestry databases. The construction of family trees from distant relatives. Each step was dissected with precision, because each step mattered. A single error could have compromised admissibility. A careless move could have destroyed the integrity of the process. But in this case, patience had matched precision. The name Jill Halliburton Sue was spoken not only in grief, but in instruction. Her case became a reminder that victims of cold cases are not forgotten entries in archives, they are anchors. They are the reason evidence must be preserved meticulously, even when hope feels thin. The community itself shifted subtly in the years following the conviction. There was relief, yes, a collective exhale that had taken 20 years to complete. But there was also an undercurrent of reflection. Residents began speaking more openly about security illusions, about the difference between appearance and reality. Gated entrances no longer symbolized invulnerability, they symbolized layers, not guarantees. Younger residents, who had been children or not yet born in 2002, learned about the case through news retrospectives and local discussions. For them, it was history, something that had happened before their awareness. But for older neighbors, it remained vivid, the sirens, the tape, the news vans lining the street. Memory does not fade evenly. It clings to those who were there. Meanwhile, appeals began moving quietly through higher courts. The defense challenged aspects of the genealogical process, arguing about privacy implications, about whether distant relatives could inadvertently expose someone to criminal investigation. Legal scholars debated the boundaries. Could a person's curiosity about ancestry inadvertently assist in solving a homicide? Was that a violation, or was it the natural evolution of forensic science? Appellate judges reviewed transcripts meticulously. They examined warrants, procedures, the chain of custody. In each review, the core remained unchanged. The DNA from 2002 matched the defendant with scientific certainty. The genealogical work had simply narrowed the search field. The conviction rested on the direct comparison. As appeals were denied one by one, the legal chapter closed more firmly. The case settled into its final form: solved, prosecuted, adjudicated. But for detectives, who had lived inside it, closure felt less like a door shutting and more like a scar healing. Some admitted privately that they had once doubted it would ever be resolved. Cold cases can erode optimism. Each failed lead chips away at belief. This one had defied that erosion not through luck, but through stubbornness. One retired investigator described it simply: we just kept the evidence alive long enough for the future to catch up. That phrase echoed beyond Boca Raton. Evidence alive long enough. Because that was the silent hero of the story, not dramatic interrogation tactics, not last-minute confessions, but preservation. The careful swabbing of a scene. The secure storage. The refusal to discard material that, at the time, yielded no match. The understanding that science evolves. In academic circles, the case was cited in discussions about the ethics of emerging technology. Universities hosted panels. Law reviews published analyses. Some argued that genetic genealogy represented a necessary tool in pursuing justice. Others warned of slippery slopes, of expanding surveillance through DNA networks. The debate was intense, nuanced, ongoing. Yet at the center of those debates remained a simple, undeniable fact. A violent act committed in 2002 had been solved because a biological trace refused to vanish. Back in Boca Raton, the house where it happened eventually changed hands. Renovations altered interiors. Paint covered old walls. Landscaping shifted the exterior's appearance. Physical spaces move forward more easily than memory. But history does not disappear simply because it is remodeled. Occasionally, on quiet evenings, neighbors would recall the long arc of the case. They would talk about how, for years, it felt like a permanent mystery, the kind that becomes folklore. They would remember the uneasy feeling that the person responsible was out there somewhere, breathing freely. And then they would recall the day the headlines changed, when the word unsolved was finally removed. The convicted man aged behind bars, his name now permanently attached to a crime he once believed would dissolve into obscurity. Time, which had shielded him for 2 decades, now stretched differently, no longer an ally, but a sentence measured in years served rather than years escaped. For the broader public, attention drifted to newer stories, newer tragedies. News cycles move relentlessly forward. But in law enforcement circles, the Boca Raton case remained a touchstone. It demonstrated that cold does not equal dead. That files labeled unsolved are not conclusions, but pauses. And perhaps that is the enduring tension in stories like this. Justice arrived, but it arrived late. The years between crime and conviction cannot be erased. The fear that rippled through a community cannot be rewound. The absence felt by a family cannot be undone by a verdict. What can be done is this: the truth can be named. The record can reflect reality. The silence can be broken. In the end, the case stands as both warning and reassurance. Warning, because violence can hide behind ordinary faces, because security systems are not impenetrable, because time can disguise guilt. Reassurance, because evidence can endure, because persistence matters, because even after 20 years, a voice preserved in microscopic strands can still speak clearly enough to change the course of a life. And in the quiet streets of Boca Raton, where palm trees sway and gates slide closed each night, that lesson remains, invisible but present, like DNA itself, a reminder that no matter how long a shadow stretches, it is never beyond the reach of light. The story should have ended with a gavel and a prison door, but some cases refuse to sit quietly in the past. They ripple outward, reshaping the future in ways no one predicted on that December afternoon in Boca Raton. Long after the conviction, investigators across the country continued to reference it in hushed, but determined tones, not as spectacle, but as proof. Proof that evidence preserved with discipline can outlive doubt. Proof that patience can be tactical. Proof that time is no longer the shield it once was. In police departments from Florida to California, cold case units began re-examining their own forgotten files. Shelves of bankers' boxes were reopened. Yellowing reports re-scanned into digital archives. Swabs that once produced no match were carefully repackaged and sent to laboratories equipped with technology that did not exist in 2002. The phrase, Boca Breakthrough, circulated informally, shorthand for a case that had waited 2 decades and still delivered a name. Inside forensic labs, analysts spoke about degradation curves, about how long biological material can survive under proper storage conditions. They pointed to this case as evidence that meticulous handling matters. The DNA tied to Jill Halliburton, Sue, had not been extraordinary in size or rarity. What made it powerful was preservation. It had been logged, sealed, climate-controlled, untouched by contamination. It had been treated not as useless residue from a failed search, but as a silent witness waiting for a future audience. That philosophy changed behavior. Evidence rooms tightened protocols. Departments reviewed storage standards. Budget meetings began including arguments not just for patrol cars and overtime, but for freezer upgrades and long-term archival systems. Because if this case proved anything, it was that a microscopic fragment can carry the weight of justice decades later. Beyond law enforcement, the cultural conversation deepened. Podcasts dissected the investigation, tracing the genealogical path from distant relatives to suspect. True crime documentaries explored the ethics of ancestry databases, asking viewers whether uploading DNA for curiosity should carry the potential consequence of aiding a homicide investigation. The debate was intense, but unavoidable. Technology had outrun old assumptions about privacy. Yet for the family, the conversation was simpler. They had waited 20 years. They had endured anniversaries marked not by answers, but by question marks. For them, the moral equation was not theoretical. A life had been taken. Science had named the man responsible. Whatever debates swirled around methodology, the outcome was tangible. In Boca Raton itself, the emotional landscape shifted slowly. There was a time when the murder defined the community's vulnerability. Then there was a time when the unsolved status defined its frustration. Now, oddly, the case defined resilience. It became an example residents pointed to when discussing persistence, how something once believed lost to time had resurfaced with clarity. Still, a subtle discomfort lingered beneath the relief. Because if a man, without a criminal record, could commit such violence and then live undetected for 20 years, what else might remain hidden in plain sight? The conviction answered who, but it did not erase the unsettling lesson about appearances. Former neighbors of the convicted man spoke occasionally to reporters. They described him as ordinary, reserved, unremarkable. No one recalled warning signs. No one described explosive behavior. That ordinariness became part of the narrative, the reminder that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly, blending into routine. Inside the prison system, the man who once walked freely through Florida heat now lived within concrete schedules and counted days. Time had reversed its allegiance. For 2 decades it had worked in his favor, distancing him from suspicion. Now it stretched endlessly in confinement. Appeals exhausted. Options narrowed. The genetic code he could not see had become the most powerful witness against him. Detectives who had shepherded the case from cold to conviction often reflected on the emotional toll. Cold cases create a specific kind of burden, unresolved energy. Every unsolved file feels like unfinished business. Closing one does not erase the others, but it injects oxygen into the unit. It reminds investigators why they keep reopening boxes, why they retest samples others might consider futile. One detective described the moment the lab confirmed the DNA match as like hearing a voice after years of static. That image stuck. Static suggests noise without meaning. For 20 years, the case had hummed in the background, present but unresolved. Then, suddenly, the signal sharpened. In legal circles, the case solidified precedent. Courts had now affirmed that genealogical pathways, when paired with direct DNA comparison and proper warrants, could stand under scrutiny. That mattered. It meant future cases would move faster. It meant other families might not have to wait 20 years for answers. But no advancement erases the cost of delay. The space between 2002 and conviction remains real. Birthdays missed. Holidays marked by absence. Memories that should have grown old together, instead frozen at a single violent interruption. And yet, there is something almost defiant in the way the story resolves. The killer believed anonymity was permanent. He believed that avoiding arrest in the early 2000s meant permanent escape. He could not predict the explosion of consumer DNA databases, the curiosity of distant relatives tracing lineage, the convergence of technology and law enforcement decades later. He miscalculated the future. That miscalculation became his undoing. In quiet training rooms, new recruits now hear about the case not as distant lore, but as living instruction. Preserve everything. Document meticulously. Assume technology will evolve. The smallest oversight today could be the difference between justice and permanent mystery tomorrow. The house in Boca Raton stands unchanged from the outside, sunlight reflecting off windows, landscaping pristine. Passers-by see only architecture. They do not see the layers of history embedded in its walls. They do not see the years when its address was synonymous with unsolved. They do not see the evidence envelope resting in an archive, now labeled closed. But those who know the story understand that the true scene of resolution was not the house. It was a laboratory bench. A computer screen displaying aligned markers. A genealogical chart branching backward through generations. A coffee cup discarded without thought. Tiny acts intersecting across decades to produce a single, irreversible outcome. The ripple effect continues. Other cold cases crack open. Other families receive calls they had almost stopped expecting. And somewhere, perhaps, another man who believes time has buried his secret feels the ground shift beneath that assumption. Because the lesson from Boca Raton is simple, stark, and impossible to ignore. Silence is not safety. Years are not armor. Evidence does not forget. It waits. There is a moment in every long investigation when the file stops feeling like paper and starts feeling like presence. For the detectives who carried the 2002 Boca Raton case across decades, that presence never really left the room. Even after conviction, even after sentencing, even after appeals thinned into silence, the weight of what happened inside that house lingered like a low hum beneath everything else. The murder of Jill Halliburton, Sue had once been defined by absence, absence of a name, absence of a match, absence of certainty. Now it was defined by something else, inevitability. Looking back, the arc feels almost mathematical. Evidence collected. Preserved. Technology advancing. A genealogical bridge forming quietly in the background of a world obsessed with ancestry kits and family trees. But living inside it never felt inevitable. It felt stalled. It felt like pushing against a locked door for years without knowing if it would ever open. In the years following the conviction, something subtle changed in the emotional climate of Boca Raton. The word unsolved no longer hovered over conversations. It no longer attached itself to anniversary news coverage. The community could finally reference the case in the past tense without an asterisk. And yet, relief carried its own complexity. When a mystery is unresolved, imagination fills the gaps. When it is resolved, reality takes its place, stark, human, disturbingly ordinary. The man who had evaded detection for 20 years was not a shadowy figure living off the grid. He had paid taxes, held jobs, interacted with neighbors. The realization unsettled people more than the crime itself. It forced a confrontation with the idea that violence can coexist with normalcy, that someone can move through daily routines while carrying an unspoken history of brutality. For the family, the years between 2002 and conviction had not been abstract time. They had been lived day by day. Every holiday a reminder. Every milestone shadowed by absence. The trial had provided legal clarity, but grief does not obey court schedules. It does not conclude with a verdict. It reshapes itself around new information, around the knowledge of who was responsible, around the understanding that he had walked free while they mourned. In law enforcement circles, the case became almost emblematic of a new era. Before, cold cases were often described with a kind of resigned tone, tragic, but likely permanent. After Boca Raton, that tone shifted. There was caution, yes, about resources and expectations, but also a renewed insistence that no biological evidence should ever be dismissed as useless simply because current databases return no match. Evidence technicians began speaking about legacy storage, about chain of custody as an act of faith in the future. The DNA that tied the convicted man to the crime scene had not been extraordinary in 2002, it had simply been unmatched. The difference between unmatched and unsolvable proved to be everything. Legal scholars continued debating the boundaries of genetic genealogy. Privacy advocates raised questions about distant relatives inadvertently placing family members under scrutiny. Prosecutors countered that direct DNA comparison, obtained lawfully, remained the cornerstone of conviction. The Boca Raton case sat at the center of those debates, cited in journals, referenced in court opinions, dissected in classrooms. But beyond academia and law enforcement, there was a quieter ripple, psychological. The case challenged assumptions about permanence, about how long a secret can remain buried. It sent a subtle message into the broader culture: the future is unpredictable, especially for those relying on outdated limitations. Somewhere in a prison facility, the man who once assumed he had outrun suspicion now lived within rigid schedules and concrete walls. For 20 years, time had widened the distance between him and the crime. Now time contracted, measured in sentences and appeals denied. The same decades that once felt like insulation now felt like delay before consequence. Detectives who revisited the case in interviews years later often returned to a single image: the evidence envelope. Sealed in 2002. Labeled carefully. Stored without fanfare. It had outlasted political administrations, budget cuts, personnel changes. It had survived moves, reorganizations, digital transitions. It had simply waited. That waiting became almost poetic in hindsight. Because while the community moved on, while media attention shifted to newer headlines, the biological truth of what happened inside that house remained unchanged. Cells do not forget. They do not reinterpret. They do not grow vague with time. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of the entire story, that the smallest fragment of a person can outlive denial. That a coffee cup discarded without thought can become the bridge between anonymity and exposure. That distant cousins exploring their ancestry can unknowingly narrow the search field of a homicide investigation decades old. The house itself no longer carries visible signs of what happened. Paint refreshed. Interiors updated. Landscaping adjusted. But history does not require visible scars to remain real. It exists in memory, in record, in the quiet understanding shared among those who know the address. Occasionally, someone new to Boca Raton will hear about the case and express surprise that it took 20 years to solve. Those who lived through it rarely frame it that way. They speak instead about endurance. About the frustration of early dead ends. About the steady belief among a handful of investigators that the answer was not gone, just waiting. Cold cases once symbolized limitation. Now they symbolize possibility, fragile, resource-dependent possibility, but possibility nonetheless. The murder that once seemed destined for permanent mystery now stands as a reminder that finality is often an illusion. And yet, beneath the broader implications, beneath the legal precedents and forensic advancements, one truth remains constant. A life was taken in 2002. A family was altered forever. A community felt its sense of security fracture in an instant. No technological triumph can rewrite that beginning. What it can do, what it did, is ensure that the story did not end with silence. In the quiet hours of the night, when Boca Raton's streets are empty and gates close with mechanical precision, the legacy of that case is not loud. It does not announce itself. It rests in the background, like the steady pulse of something persistent. A reminder that evidence, however small, carries memory. That patience can stretch across decades. That the future is always advancing toward the past. And that somewhere, in climate-controlled storage or digital code, the truth waits, patient, precise, and far more durable than anyone who once believed it would fade. 2 decades is long enough for a child to become an adult, for neighborhoods to change, for technology to rewrite the rules of everyday life. It should have been long enough for a killer to disappear into history. But history has a way of circling back, and in Boca Raton, the circle closed with a precision no one could have imagined in 2002. By the time the case reached its 20th anniversary, it had already transformed from active horror to lingering question mark. 4 years, it existed in that uneasy space, not forgotten, but unresolved. The name Jill Halliburton surfaced every December in local news segments, accompanied by archival footage of flashing lights and quiet cul-de-sacs. The tone was always the same, dignified, restrained, unresolved. Now, in retrospect, those anniversaries feel different. They were not markers of stagnation. They were countdowns. What makes this case linger in public consciousness is not just the brutality of the crime, but the audacity of its concealment. A man entered a gated community in broad daylight. A violent act unfolded behind secure doors. And then he stepped back into the world as if nothing had happened. No confession. No arrest. No immediate consequence. Just silence. That silence became its own character. For investigators, silence is not absence. It is pressure. It builds. It presses against instinct. It forces re-examination of every overlooked detail. In the Boca Raton case, silence lasted years longer than anyone wanted. Leads evaporated. Tips contradicted each other. The DNA profile returned no match. And yet the file never truly closed. The turning point, genealogical tracing through distant relatives, felt almost improbable when first discussed. It required a shift in mindset. Instead of waiting for the suspect to enter a criminal database, investigators looked sideways, outward, into the expanding universe of consumer DNA. It was a gamble grounded in science, not hope. When the family tree began to narrow, when male descendants were filtered by age and geography, the case shifted from abstract to imminent. Surveillance followed. A discarded coffee cup was collected without ceremony. The laboratory comparison was conducted with the quiet hum of machines that do not understand the gravity of what they reveal. And when the match came back, it was not dramatic. It was definitive. The aftermath was complex. Arrest. Trial. Conviction. Sentencing. Each stage delivered legal clarity, but also reopened old wounds. The community experienced relief tempered by disbelief. For 20 years, the perpetrator had lived among ordinary routines, grocery stores, workplaces, neighborhoods, undetected. That ordinariness disturbed people more deeply than any cinematic image of a lurking villain. It forced a recognition that evil does not always signal itself with chaos. Sometimes it is patient. Sometimes it is methodical. Sometimes it waits, believing time will bury it. Time did not bury this one. In the years since the conviction, the case has been cited as a landmark example of what modern forensic science can accomplish. Law enforcement agencies have followed its blueprint. Evidence rooms have been re-evaluated. Cold case units have received renewed funding. There is now an unspoken understanding. Do not assume today's limitations will define tomorrow's capabilities. Yet even with technological triumph, there remains a quiet, sobering truth. Justice was delayed. A family carried uncertainty for 20 years. Detectives aged alongside the file. Some retired before the arrest, never seeing the resolution firsthand. The arc may appear clean in hindsight, but living through it was anything but. The convicted man's life is now measured in years served. The same decades that once insulated him now stretch as confinement. Appeals have narrowed. Legal avenues exhausted. The DNA that linked him to the crime scene remains immutable, immune to reinterpretation. It is a fixed point in a story that once felt fluid. Back in Boca Raton, daily life has reclaimed its rhythm. Children play in streets once lined with news vans. Homes change ownership. Landscaping evolves. But history does not vanish simply because it grows quieter. It integrates. It becomes part of the soil. The house where it happened stands as architecture, not spectacle. Passers-by see walls and windows, not evidence markers. But beneath fresh paint and renovated rooms lies the memory of a December afternoon that fractured certainty. And beneath that memory lies something else, the knowledge that the fracture was not permanent. There is something almost unsettling about how small the decisive piece of evidence ultimately was. Not a dramatic eyewitness account. Not a last-minute confession. Just microscopic strands left behind in a moment of violence. Invisible. Silent. But persistent. The story of this case is not merely about a crime. It is about endurance. It is about the quiet faith that evidence deserves preservation even when it appears inert. It is about detectives who refuse to mark a file as hopeless. It is about the unpredictable evolution of science intersecting with unfinished business. And perhaps most of all, it is about the illusion of permanence, the belief that if enough years pass, the past loses its power. In Boca Raton, that illusion shattered. A man once believed he had outrun suspicion. He believed databases would never contain his name. He believed the absence of a 2002 match was a lifetime guarantee. He misjudged the future. Because the future arrived carrying ancestry websites, advanced sequencing, and investigators willing to look beyond conventional pathways. It arrived quietly, methodically, and without drama, until the moment handcuffs clicked shut. Now, when people reference the case, they do so with a different tone. Not just tragedy. Not just shock. But resolve. A recognition that cold does not mean forgotten. That silence is not safety. That evidence, when respected, can outlast denial. In the stillness of a South Florida night, when the gates close and the streets empty, the legacy of that December day is no longer defined by mystery. It is defined by persistence. By the steady, patient march of time toward accountability. The DNA waited. The file remained open. The future caught up. And in the end, what once felt like an unsolvable fracture in a quiet community became something else entirely, a reminder that no matter how far someone believes they have distanced themselves from a single violent act, the smallest trace can follow them across decades, across shifting technologies, across the illusion of safety, until the truth finally stands in open court and refuses to be silent any longer. Part 11. The file never closed. It just thickened. By 2012, the murder of Jill Halliburton, Sue had become a permanent fixture inside the Boca Raton Police Department, no longer an active fire, but an ember that refused to die. Detectives rotated in and out of the unit. New faces studied old photographs. Fresh eyes stared at the same crime scene images taken on a humid December afternoon in 2002, trying to see what their predecessors had missed. The house looked deceptively calm in those photos, Spanish-style architecture, manicured hedges, the kind of property that whispers wealth and security. But inside, frozen in time, was violence so intimate it felt personal. The ligature. The duct tape. The forced entry through a rear window. The missing jewelry. Every detail catalogued, recatalogued, digitized. Evidence that once sat in cardboard boxes was transferred into climate-controlled storage. DNA samples, carefully preserved, became the silent heart of the investigation. Back in 2002, forensic science had limits. Profiles were partial. Databases were smaller. Leads fizzled. But technology does not stand still. It waits. It sharpens. And so the detectives waited too. The community had long stopped expecting answers. Boca Raton moved on the way affluent communities often do, quietly, efficiently, with a kind of collective denial. New families moved into the neighborhood. The Sioux residence eventually changed hands. Children played in driveways where crime scene tape once fluttered. But beneath the surface, there was always that whisper, the killer had walked among them. Maybe still did. Cold case. Two words that feel clinical, but they carry weight. They mean birthdays missed. They mean a husband who still avoids certain rooms in his memory. They mean parents who aged with a question mark hanging over every holiday dinner. The absence never softened, it calcified. In 2015, a new generation of investigators reopened the file with something their predecessors didn't fully have: genetic genealogy. Across the country, law enforcement agencies were beginning to experiment with a controversial, but powerful tool, comparing crime scene DNA not just to convicted offenders, but to distant relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic profiles to public databases. It had worked elsewhere. It had cracked cases that were decades old. Murders once thought unsolvable suddenly had names attached to them. The Boca Raton team revisited the preserved DNA from the crime scene. It was still viable. Still strong enough to speak. They sent it out for advanced testing. Weeks passed. Then months. Data processed, reprocessed. Analysts built a profile that extended beyond CODIS, beyond traditional law enforcement networks. They were no longer looking for the killer directly. They were looking for his shadow, second cousins, third cousins, fragments of family trees stretching back generations. Somewhere out there, someone shared blood with the man who tied those knots. The first results came back as distant matches. Not enough to identify, but enough to begin building a map. Genealogists, part detective, part historian, began tracing lineage lines through census records, marriage certificates, obituaries. They followed surnames across states. They built branching diagrams that sprawled across whiteboards and computer screens. One branch began to narrow. A family line rooted in the Midwest. Connections that eventually extended to Florida. A cluster of males who would have been in their 20s in 2002. One name surfaced more than once in proximity to South Florida during that period. James Timothy Barnes. At first, it was just a name among many. But records showed something that made detectives pause. In 2002, Barnes had been living in Florida. He had a criminal history, violent offenses, burglary, assault. A pattern that suggested familiarity with breaking into homes. And then another detail: he had worked in the Boca Raton area. The air in the cold case unit shifted. They pulled his file. Mugshots from the early 2000s. Arrest reports. Addresses. Employment records. He wasn't a stranger passing through. He had been there. Close enough to know the layout of upscale neighborhoods. Close enough to blend in. But suspicion is not proof. They needed confirmation. Surveillance began quietly. By then, Barnes was older. Living in another state. He had built a life that looked, on the surface, ordinary. The kind of life that hides in plain sight. Neighbors described him as unremarkable. Quiet. A man who kept to himself. Detectives didn't knock on his door. Instead, they waited. One evening, officers observed him discard trash outside his residence. A coffee cup. A plastic bottle. Items handled, used, abandoned. Perfectly legal to collect. Perfectly legal to test. They retrieved the items. Back in the lab, technicians swabbed the surfaces. Extracted DNA. Compared it to the profile preserved from the Boca Raton crime scene, a profile that had waited more than a decade for this moment. The match came back conclusive. The numbers weren't ambiguous. They weren't partial. They aligned with a precision that left no room for coincidence. The killer had a name. But for the family, and for the community, the revelation was not immediate. Law enforcement moved carefully. They reviewed every step. Confirmed chain of custody. Double-checked forensic procedures. The weight of 20 years demanded certainty. When the arrest warrant was signed, it carried with it 2 decades of silence. In 2023, officers took Barnes into custody. No dramatic chase. No public spectacle. Just a quiet operation that marked the end of a long, invisible pursuit. He was charged with first-degree murder for the killing of Jill Halliburton Sue. The news detonated in Boca Raton like a delayed shockwave. Headlines flashed across local and national outlets. A case once labeled unsolved, cold, forgotten by many, had been cracked. Neighbors who had long since packed away their fears felt them resurface in an instant. The realization was chilling. The man responsible had been living freely all this time. For the Sue family, the arrest was not celebration. It was something more complicated. Relief tangled with grief. Justice, yes, but delayed, stretched thin by years that could never be returned. The wound reopened even as it began, finally, to close. In interviews, law enforcement officials spoke about perseverance. About the evolution of forensic science. About the importance of never giving up on a case. But beneath the official statements was something more human, the understanding that technology had become the voice of the victim when no one else could speak. DNA does not forget. The house in Boca Raton still stands. The street still fills with sunlight each afternoon. Cars pass. Children ride bikes. On the surface, it is just another quiet Florida neighborhood. But for those who remember December 2002, it will always be a place where illusion shattered, where security proved fragile, where violence slipped through a window and rewrote lives. Cold case solved. 3 words that carry power. But they do not erase the night. They do not undo the fear that lingered for years. They do not give back the moments stolen from a family. They simply draw a line under a question mark that hung for 20 years. And yet, even with an arrest, even with a name attached to the crime, the echo remains. Because the story was never just about a killer hiding in plain sight. It was about time, about how justice can move slowly, almost imperceptibly, and then arrive all at once. In the end, the breakthrough did not come from a confession or a dramatic witness. It came from data. From science advancing quietly in laboratories while the world carried on. It came from the persistence of investigators who refused to let a file gather dust. It came from a community that never fully forgot. And somewhere in the silence that followed the arrest, there was a shift, a subtle release of breath held for 2 decades. The case that once haunted Boca Raton no longer lived in the realm of mystery. But its shadow will always remain. The courtroom felt smaller than anyone remembered. Not physically smaller, the same polished wood, the same flags standing stiff behind the bench, but compressed under the weight of 21 years. When James Timothy Barnes was led inside, shackled at the wrists, the air shifted. He did not look like the ghost people had imagined for 2 decades. He looked older, heavier, human. And that was almost more unsettling. Across the room, members of the family of Jill Halliburton sat in stillness. No outbursts. No dramatic gestures. Just quiet endurance. The same quiet endurance that had carried them from December 2002 to this moment. The prosecution began with facts. December 7, 2002. Forced entry through a rear window. Ligature strangulation. DNA left behind. Evidence preserved. The words sounded clinical, almost detached, but every sentence landed like a reopened wound. Jurors leaned forward. Some avoided eye contact with the defendant. Others studied him carefully, searching for something: remorse, indifference, recognition. His face gave little away. The defense did what defense attorneys do. They questioned chain of custody. They scrutinized the genealogy process. They raised concerns about privacy, about database procedures, about the reliability of distant relative matching. They did not deny the DNA match outright, the numbers were too precise, but they suggested alternative possibilities. Contamination. Misinterpretation. Statistical misunderstanding. The prosecution responded with calm precision. Expert witnesses took the stand. Forensic analysts explained how the preserved crime scene sample had been reprocessed using advanced technology unavailable in 2002. They walked the jury through genetic genealogy step by step, how distant relatives in public databases led investigators to a narrowed family tree, how surveillance yielded discarded items, how direct comparison confirmed the match with scientific certainty. There was no drama in their voices. Just numbers. Percentages. Probabilities approaching impossibility. And then came the timeline. In 2002, Barnes had been living in Florida. He had a record of burglary and violent behavior. He had worked in affluent neighborhoods. He knew the layout of gated communities. He knew that mornings were often quiet, that residents felt safe. He had the kind of history that prosecutors framed not as coincidence, but as pattern. The jury saw photographs of the house again, the Spanish-style facade in Boca Raton, the carefully landscaped yard. They saw interior images, sanitized but still haunting. They heard about the jewelry taken, the ransacked rooms, the abrupt violence in the middle of a normal Saturday. Each detail tightened the room. Outside the courthouse, media trucks lined the street. Reporters spoke into cameras with phrases that had once seemed permanent: cold case breakthrough, DNA genealogy arrest, 2-decade mystery. The case had transformed from local tragedy to national example of how forensic science could reach back in time and pull someone forward into accountability. But inside, it was personal. Friends of Jill described her as vibrant, warm, engaged in her community. They spoke of her involvement in charity events, of the shock that rippled through Boca Raton when news first broke in 2002. One witness described the day as if it had happened yesterday: helicopters overhead, police tape snapping in the wind, neighbors gathered in stunned silence. The defense attempted to humanize Barnes. They spoke of difficult upbringing, of instability, of struggles. They did not offer a clear alternative suspect. They did not provide an alibi for that December morning. Instead, they leaned into doubt, the thin space where reasonable uncertainty might live. But the DNA evidence remained immovable. When the prosecution displayed the final comparison chart, crime scene profile aligned with Barnes' discarded DNA sample, the courtroom projector hummed softly. Rows of markers matched. Identical sequences. The expert explained it plainly. The probability of the DNA belonging to someone else was astronomically small. Not unlikely. Not rare. Astronomical. Jurors scribbled notes. Some nodded slightly. Others stared at the screen as if trying to absorb the magnitude of it. How a microscopic trace left in 2002 could survive decades, and still point unerringly to one individual. The trial was not long. The evidence did not allow it to stretch into spectacle. After closing arguments, the jury retreated. Hours passed. In the hallway, family members waited. No cameras allowed in that space. Just quiet breathing. Hands clasped. 21 years condensed into the ticking of a courthouse clock. When the jury returned, the room rose. Guilty. The word did not explode. It settled heavily, like a final stone placed on a grave that had remained partially open for too long. Barnes showed little visible reaction. A slight shift of posture. A blink. The deputies moved closer. For the Sue family, the verdict was not triumph. It was release, fragile, complicated, edged with grief. Justice had arrived, but late. The years in between could not be undone. The holidays spent wondering. The birthdays marked by absence. The endless replay of that December morning. Sentencing followed weeks later. Prosecutors emphasized the brutality of the crime and the decades of unresolved trauma inflicted on the family. The defense asked for consideration of age, of time past. The judge listened, expression measured. Life imprisonment. Another phrase that sounds procedural, but carries immense weight. As Barnes was led away, the chapter that began in 2002 formally closed inside a courtroom. But outside, the impact radiated further. Law enforcement agencies across the country cited the case as validation of genetic genealogy's power. Other cold case units revisited their evidence lockers with renewed urgency. Families waiting for answers saw a flicker of possibility. Boca Raton felt the shift too. The neighborhood where it happened had long since resumed its rhythm, morning joggers, manicured lawns, the low hum of routine. Yet when the verdict was announced, conversations resurfaced. People who had lived there in 2002 recalled the fear that once crept through their streets. Parents who had once double-checked locks now spoke openly about how the arrest changed their understanding of time and justice. Because the truth is unsettling, for more than 20 years, the man responsible had lived freely. He had eaten in restaurants, walked under open skies, shared spaces with unsuspecting strangers. The distance between crime and consequence had stretched thin, until science snapped it back into place. And still, beneath the sense of resolution, there lingered an echo. The case was cracked. The perpetrator identified, tried, convicted. Officially, it was over. But the image of that December afternoon in 2002 does not fade so easily. The quiet house, the broken window, the first responders stepping into something they could not yet comprehend. The community, that once believed itself insulated from such violence, learned a permanent lesson about vulnerability. Time moved forward. It always does. Yet every so often, when the Florida sun hits at a certain angle, when the air carries that same soft winter warmth, those who remember can almost feel the weight of the years collapsing inward, from 2023 back to 2002, as if the past is never entirely past. Cold case. Solved. 2 words separated by 2 decades. And in between them, a family's endurance, a community's unease, and the silent patience of evidence waiting in the dark until the world finally caught up. After the verdict, the silence felt different. Not the oppressive silence of uncertainty that had hung over Boca Raton since 2002, but a quieter, more complicated stillness, the kind that follows impact. The headlines faded within days. News vans disappeared. National attention shifted to the next breaking story. But inside the Sue family, inside the investigators who had carried the file for years, the weight did not simply lift. It rearranged itself. For more than 2 decades, the murder of Jill Halliburton, Sue had existed as a question. A wound without closure. Now it had a verdict, a life sentence, a name permanently attached, James Timothy Barnes. The transformation from mystery to certainty should have felt clean. It didn't. Because when a case goes cold, it doesn't freeze in isolation. It freezes people in time. The husband who found his world shattered that December morning had learned to live with ambiguity, to survive without answers. His grief had adapted to uncertainty. Now certainty demanded a different reckoning. The image of an unknown intruder was replaced by a specific face. A specific history. A man who had walked freely for 20 years. There is something uniquely disturbing about delayed justice. It forces everyone to confront the distance between what happened and when accountability arrives. Barnes had aged. His hair thinned. His body changed. Meanwhile, the victim never aged beyond that winter morning. The contrast was brutal. In interviews after sentencing, law enforcement officials emphasized perseverance. They described the evolution of DNA technology. They pointed to genetic genealogy as the bridge across decades. But behind the press conferences, there was an unspoken acknowledgement: the system had not solved this case quickly. It had solved it eventually. Eventually. That word carries both hope and indictment. The evidence that ultimately convicted Barnes had existed from the beginning, microscopic traces preserved carefully in evidence lockers. In 2002, the science simply wasn't ready. Code searches yielded nothing. The DNA profile sat, waiting for a future that had not yet arrived. Detectives retired. Supervisors changed. Budgets fluctuated. Yet the sample remained, silent and patient. It is unsettling to realize how many other cases sit in similar darkness. Across the country, cold case units began referencing Boca Raton as proof of concept. If this could be solved after 2 decades, what else was possible? Evidence rooms were reopened. Files were dusted off. Families who had grown accustomed to annual, no-update phone calls began receiving new ones, cautious, careful, but charged with possibility. The ripple effect was real. But for the Sue family, the ripple was personal. Victim impact statements during sentencing were measured, restrained. There was no theatrical rage. Just the articulation of years lost, anniversaries marked by absence, milestones experienced through a lens of trauma. The words were not meant for headlines. They were meant for the man standing before them in chains. Barnes listened. Or appeared to. His face remained largely impassive. Whether that expression masked denial, regret, or emptiness, no one could say. He had maintained innocence through trial. No dramatic confession came. No explanation of motive. The burglary gone wrong theory stood, supported by evidence of forced entry and theft. But the inner narrative, the precise sequence of thoughts that led him through that window in 2002, remained locked inside him. And perhaps that is one final cruelty of violent crime. Even with a conviction, some questions never fully answer themselves. Why that house? Why that morning? Why escalate to murder? The prosecution's reconstruction suggested panic, struggle, an attempt to silence a witness. But the absence of a confession leaves a sliver of shadow. Not enough to undermine guilt. Enough to remind everyone that certainty in court does not equal complete understanding. In Boca Raton, the neighborhood where it happened absorbed the news in waves. Longtime residents remembered the helicopters, the police tape, the fear that rippled through gated communities once considered immune to random violence. Newer residents learned the history of their quiet street through archived articles and late-night internet searches. The house itself, renovated, repainted, reoccupied, stands as physical proof that time moves on even when memory resists. Children have played in rooms that once held investigators in gloves and booties. Dinner parties have filled spaces that once felt like epicenters of horror. Architecture does not carry visible scars. People do. For detectives who inherited the case years after the original crime, the conviction carried a specific satisfaction. They had not been there in 2002. They had not walked the fresh crime scene. Yet they felt ownership of the outcome. They had believed in the evidence. They had pushed for genealogical testing. They had waited for lab results that could just as easily have come back inconclusive. Instead, the science aligned. Genetic genealogy remains controversial in some circles. Questions of privacy, database consent, the ethics of tracing family trees without direct permission. The Boca Raton case became part of that broader national conversation. Supporters pointed to justice delivered. Critics cautioned against unchecked expansion. The debate unfolded in legal journals and policy forums far removed from the original crime scene. But for the family, the philosophical arguments were secondary. The man responsible would never walk free again. Still, the emotional landscape after resolution is rarely simple. When a case is unsolved, hope and dread coexist. Once solved, hope disappears, replaced by finality. There will be no dramatic new lead. No surprise revelation that changes the story. The narrative is set. The file is stamped closed. Closure is not the same as healing. Therapists who work with long-term victims' families often describe a second wave of processing after convictions in cold cases. The mind, which had learned to live with uncertainty, must now reorganize around certainty. Anger can resurface. Grief can intensify before it softens. The passage of time does not blunt the original trauma, it layers over it. In interviews, members of the Sue family expressed gratitude for the investigators' persistence. They thanked the jury. They spoke of justice. But beneath their composure lay decades of endurance invisible to the public. Private moments of collapse, quiet resilience, the decision each day to keep living despite the unresolved. Now the unresolved was resolved. And yet, in the quiet hours of night, memory does not consult court transcripts. It replays images. It revisits that December day. It asks what might have been different if science had been faster, if databases had been larger, if technology had leapt forward sooner. These are questions without productive answers. The broader message of the case, repeated by officials in press conferences, was clear: no case is ever truly closed while evidence remains. Time is not always the ally of the perpetrator. Sometimes it is the ally of truth. In the Florida sunlight, life continues. The gated entrances open and close. Security patrols circle. Neighbors greet each other with polite nods. The visible world looks unchanged from the outside. But beneath that surface, there is an invisible marker now, a line drawn between past and present. Between fear and accountability. Between a cold case headline and a conviction. For 21 years, the story of Jill Halliburton, Sue hovered in suspended animation. Now it rests in history books, legal records, archived broadcasts. Solved. And yet, as with all crimes that shatter ordinary mornings, there remains a faint, persistent echo, a reminder that safety can fracture in an instant, that justice can take decades, and that sometimes the smallest trace left behind can outlast silence itself.